Thank you very much, Lloyd, for having me come up. I enjoy coming up to Wyoming. I've been up a couple times for the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute meetings in July when they don't conflict with family time back in Kansas where I grew up. I live in Houston. I've been around the oil sector for a long time, have horse and cattle and farming in the background the way I grew up. Did a little stint in New York City like every young person might do out of college that wants to get away from ranching and farming for a day or two. Anyway, it got me to Houston, got me to energy, and here I am today. So again, thank you very much. And there are a couple of familiar faces in the crowd, so I don't feel too out of place here too much. I do feel a little vulnerable with this being happy hour cocktail time, but I suppose I can duck if things start coming at me too hard. Background. I'm with a group called FernOil, which is part of it's a Norwegian company called Astrup Fearnleys out of Oslo. Fearnleys has been around since 1865, running the ships for the ship owners, and there's quite a few of them in Norway. They've been doing it a long time, tall ships up to present. They also manage the charter parties that take the ships from the ship owners, and they also work with the ship owners when they want to trade out the vessels, pick up new ones, go to the shipyards and build new ones. And that. We also have a large physical commodities desk out of Paris, all energy related. So we get to see the ships, we get to see where they go, we get to see what they're carrying, we get to know what's on them, we get to know where the commodities come from, we know how they price, we know who owns them, we know where they've come from, they know where they go on a global scale. I can't tell you any of that, but I can tell you that we know a lot about it. And so out of that, I get a chance to do some of this. The other hat I have on is I'm the Executive Director for the North American Carbon Capture Storage Association. I'm in Houston. The association's based up in Washington. Got a full-time general counsel, covers my backside every time I walk into D.C., which is usually pretty necessary. My members are companies like Shell, BP, Kinder Morgan, Oxy. Anadarko's been a member for a number of years. Peabody up until recently, with everything changing. A lot of things have changed. American Petroleum Institute is also one of my members. We work on what happens to CO2 after it's been captured. We're agnostic to technology. We're agnostic how the CO2 might originate, but if it's going to get handled and it's going to get pushed around, it's going to get regulated, we jump in the middle of it to make sure that a valuable commodity doesn't get shut down as a pollutant or a waste. And it keeps us fairly busy. There's a lot of folks in Washington that think this is nasty stuff and work very hard to keep it that way. So I won't belabor that. I think you've seen enough of that already. Topics: OPEC, carbon, CO2, coal and CO2 EOR, coal markets, LNG, and shipping, and I get to cover this all in 15 minutes, or something like that. OPEC, for those that don't remember, OPEC was formed back in 1960, 5 founders, a few other countries joined them. By the 80s, they'd gotten to feeling their oats and decided to put the squeeze on how oil should price. There'd been an embargo prior to that because of war with a couple of the neighbors in Israel. And then by 1985, members were jumping all over themselves trying to get as much production to the market and get as much money as they could per barrel. The Saudis said, to heck with that, kicked production up and took the price right on down to $10 a barrel. Not unlike what's going on today. Why is this important? 1985, 1987, we had energy efficiency. We had condensed solar. We had photovoltaic. We had electric vehicles in California. We had compressed natural gas in all the major municipalities. We had coal gasification in North Dakota. We had, in fact, condensed solar was called Solar One, and it's now called, lo and behold, Ivanhoe. Something new and different, just 30 years redone. All this stuff was on the table. It was running, it was subsidized, it was cranking out, it was making America energy independent, and the Saudis pulled the plug and took it to below $10 a barrel. It was a BTU game. Every bit of that I rattled off was bankrupt by 1988. Every single bit of it. And don't think that wasn't what was probably in the back of everybody's minds when they took it down to 43 bucks WTI numbers in the last 10 days. That changed yesterday and today. Keep it in mind that history has a way of repeating itself, and unless you've been around from the 80s, most people forgot this stuff had even happened once before. Everything we're doing today, we've done once before, just in a little different scale, a little grander. So talking OPEC, So we're talking international markets. So there's really four main players to have any impact on what crude oil might do. Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, and the U.S. Russia, or Saudi Arabia, because they've always been the traditional swing producer. 9 to 11 million barrels a day is their swing run. Russia, 9 to 10 million barrels a day. We may not necessarily get along with a lot of things that they do, but they produce a heck of a lot of oil. And they have a lot of influence in a lot of markets that the U.S. does not get involved in. They have customers that we won't deal with, which really mucks up the water a little bit. Iraq, we spent a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of people to get Iraq back onto the table. Now they are the primary swing producer in the Middle East. They hit 4 million barrels a day 2 weeks ago, 35-year record of production. They're shooting for 6 million a day, and they really don't care what price is. They just want to get the production to the market. So everybody has to look around that group of four and say, who takes the 2 million additional barrels a day fall? Nobody so far. And of course you have us. Out of left field with technology, which we're good at doing, we bring oil and oil-related liquids and natural gas to the marketplace in such a force that we've pretty much topped Saudi as the lead producer in the world for hydrocarbon energy, oil, gas equivalent, or oil equivalent through gas, and also the associated liquids. So one of the four of us has to blink. Who blinks? Well, Saudi's a monarchy. Whatever the king says, the people do. Russia, kind of the same, but he's not a king. Iraq, that's a proxy for Iran. So whatever Iran wants Iraq to do, Iraq does. Regardless of what you read in the papers, Iraq is a proxy for Iran. And Iran and Saudi don't see things eye to eye, so Iraq is going to do whatever is possible to keep the Saudis off balance. And then there's us. We're the nice guys. So what happens? We blinked this week. For the month of January, the rig count dropped by another 276 rigs just in January, 18.4% just in January. An estimated 94 rigs were scrapped from operation, the single weekly drop on record of rigs going offline. So why is that important? That's important because the ripple effects are going to be pretty consequential. We're waiting for the tsunami in Houston right now. Everybody knows it's coming. We just don't know who's going to get hit first. So this is the activity in the field. Now, the day-to-day production doesn't change overnight, but there is something that does affect how this happens. All that new production in the U.S. to speak of comes from oil and gas shale plays. These are the decline curves for the typical, there's really no such thing as typical, but we'll call it typical in this case. Typical gas well, shale gas well, and a typical oil shale well. That's a very, very, very fast decline curve. Wells that were drilled 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, that's what they look like. The good news is if you drill a well today with today's technology and how efficiently they get in and how they're able to get into the resources, the decline curve is not nearly as severe. The problem is those are the wells that we're supposed to be drilling that we've shutting all the rigs down on. So the wells we got left with are these wells, and they're going to start dropping like flies. And the guys around the world looking at our production, looking at these rigs going offline, and they're drilling them faster, which means the replenishment rate for the wells that we lose, we can replenish fast. We're taking these rigs offline pretty quick. This happened today. So oil minister from Saudi, or from the OPEC comes out and says, hey, somebody blinked. We're going to go to $200 a barrel now. Well, probably not quite real quick, but there's this enthusiasm in the market. Everybody's on the bandwagon. Crude oil rocketed like a little rocket ship this afternoon. While we were all sitting in here, we had about a $6 a barrel flutter to the upside. I'm not quite sure where it settled out at the end of the day, but it took a real hard run to the high side. I'm a commodities guy by background. World I come from, we call this a bull trap. The production didn't turn off. Only the sentiment about which way the market should go did. So the market believes it should go higher. But tomorrow morning, somebody's going to look around and go, God, you know, the barrels are still coming out of the ground. Those decline curves we're talking about, they're there. They just they didn't kick in overnight, just that the rigs aren't drilling. Somewhere along the line, that will kick in. The key's going to be, did we actually hit a bottom? Did we get too much enthusiasm to drive the price up and suck a lot of new people in to think they should own barrels at these price points, when those four guys haven't really agreed that any one of the four of us really did blink? Everybody's declared the U.S. blinked, and by actions it looks like we blinked, but Iraq didn't slow down their production. Russia hadn't stopped their production, and Saudi had. In fact, I read last week they'd upped their production a couple of more notches. So I don't know where it goes, but if you were going to be long, you should have been long yesterday morning. I don't know what you do now. Stay tuned. So carbon. We're all here talking about a lot of things that we're being driven around because global interest in carbon, climate change, carbon management, whatever you want to call it. And, you know, I came across this. Now, this was actually done in 2008. And it's kind of like the EPA doing data surveys in advance of like building regulations. They got to have data first. Well, scientists do a lot of experiments first to see which might work best. And over the last half dozen years, this strapping a bag on a bad methane producing cow is not a bad idea. I actually read where they tallied up the number of green jobs this would create. When they took the number of cattle that there were in the United States and Argentina, and I'm not joking. This is that's methane, so it's worse than CO2. So I guess you can justify the bag and maybe you use it for compressed natural gas in your city vehicles or something. I get a lot of people collecting bags and emptying cows and enhanced cow gasification. I don't know, and there's carbon credits you get off of it. It's a whole industry wrapped around it. You got to do MRV to make sure you're getting the right kind of methane in the right place at the right time to get the right credits to the right people. Laugh about it, but globally, carbon markets are a real deal. They're all around us. They're here. They're very much a part of a lot of countries' forward planning. And you know, I come from parts of Kansas and parts of Texas where, you know, some of this is just still a little too hard to swallow. And I'll run with the flow and I'll go, that's true, but there's a global community out there that's making it a little less easy to deny these things are taking place. We're beyond that point of pushing too hard back. The momentum's in the system, as they would say. So, 2013, the unburnable carbon. Now, my members were hit by this, coal guys and the oil and gas guys. Unburnable carbon. What was that? That was the stuff that you claimed on your books as a reserve that had value because of future production. The environmental community came back and says, there'll be too much CO2 emitted by any of that stuff you plan to burn in the future. So it's actually, instead of a future asset, it's a future liability that you, in an obligation to your publicly held company's shareholders, you must report as a liability. And of course, the response was right. Well, that was 2013. This is now 2015. I will tell you that a couple of my members at a board level have taken this as a very serious consideration. Large institutional investors, not you and I or me with 10 shares is something, but institutional investors that hold 5, 10, 15, 20% voting blocks of common stock that have been banded together in coalitions, much like they did with utility industry and oil and gas about half dozen years ago when Sister Pat Daly walked around with the proxies to force governance change in publicly held companies on carbon issues, much the same has taken place here, but now it's different. Now it's got a little bit of a liability twist to it. Sarbanes-Oxley says that if you're an officer in a company and you're signing documents and you're saying, my asset's not a liability, I know because I said so, I'm the chief financial officer. Under Sarbanes-Oxley, somebody sues and says you were wrong, you're the one that goes to prison, you're the one that pays the fine, and you're the one that's kicked out of the industry. So chief financial officers for large publicly held companies are not so quick to sign those documents until this is actually something that's been cleared and vetted. But you don't have a lot of time. These reports are due every year. So there's unique pressures coming in from different places. This changes future perceptions of what a country's, companies, regions, hydrocarbon assets may actually be worth in the future. So pick and choose your pathways very well, because it will determine how this stuff sets the value for your resources. And the administration raises the societal cost of carbon that greenhouse gas emissions represent to the government when they're writing policy. Doesn't seem like a big deal. But when you start reading the claims, if we do this regulation, we take these steps, we're going to save this much money to the American taxpayer. And then they use the dollar, or we're going to save these many lives. We're going to save these many people from getting asthma. And then they put a dollar value on it. And they use the dollar value to rack up against the liability value of the asset that has yet to be produced. They can argue then if you're going to produce that asset that produces that CO2, it will create that kind of societal impact on the people around you, and what are you going to do to mitigate that dollar impact to your public shareholders? You got to have an answer. So it's kind of interesting. So then it takes us to what happened in the election cycle. Kind of red, kind of a lot of red, kind of really a lot of red, and except there's a little twist. Anywhere you want to export some of our hydrocarbons out of this country, it's all blue. Even down here in Houston, Houston Ship Channel, Houston's blue, and Louisiana, down around New Orleans, all the major port areas are blue. So I don't have a solution for you, by the way, but I can tell you is that there's a lot of red, but there's still blue in really critical places. So you either figure out a way to have new friends or make it all red. Coal and CO2 EOR. I spend a lot of time in this space. You guys have been beat to death with the same map of your resources, but I like to tell people, not in a crowd like this so much, is that it isn't about the utility industry, it's about the guy that owns that resource. All those coal resources, and this applies around the world, somebody owns that. Wyoming has state owners and local owners and federal owners, but people own a very valuable commodity, high energy density, ubiquitous technology around the world to consume it, easily transported, really valuable. So if you own that, you're going to go to great lengths to monetize that. So the traditional pathway to monetize coal was to sell it to a utility, and it was a good, solid, steady customer. And they're going to be there for a while to come. But just like Southern Company with its trig is gasification. It's new technology to get to the same point and take that lignite that had zero value in Mississippi and monetize it for the state of Mississippi. It's cost Southern a lot of money to get to this point, but they've learned a lot of lessons. But what they're doing is they're working to monetize that resource and keep it creating value. The market model's changed, but the commodity hasn't. Remember that. There's a lot of value there. A lot of commodity. So you got to get creative. Carl talked about a lot of the different ways of taking coal and creating additional products out of it. We got a little competition with gas for the moment, but I'll emphasize moment. Remember those decline curves. We're not drilling new gas wells. We haven't been drilling new gas wells of any degree for quite a while. Where most of U.S.'s surplus gas has come from is the associated gas out of the other fields that have been producing gas liquids and crude. Guess what they're going to be doing? Yeah, gas. Stay tuned. Gas will be supplied for a while, but things change quickly. I talk about the coal utilization. I reiterate what Carl said. So for my world, if I have CO2 and a lot of it, I've been watching CO2 EOR, and globally there's a lot of mature oil fields that can take CO2, put it to work, make it a valuable commodity, create value for a mature field owner, and also make value for the guy that owns the CO2. The numbers were staggering. Up to 2009, 468 billion barrels of identified resource around the world that could use CO2. That was before we did the studies on the residual oil zone and what is potential with depleted shale. So size of the EOR prize, December, and Julio's group in oil and gas at DOE funded it, did a study to look at this particular area of what they call the oil contact zone in a field setting. Over geologic time, make it simple, the geology shifted back and forth. So you had oil that sloshed through the rock. Rock is wetted, you can drill a core, you drill down, drill a well, take a core, you'll get a shell, but you can't produce the oil, you can produce water. You put CO2 down in there and it produces just like it's a mature field that's been on a heavy water flood and it's at the tail end of a water flood. Turns out in West Texas, a 4-county area alone, 109 billion barrels of additional resources now recoverable using CO2. And that's residual oil zone. Wyoming has it in the 10 sleep fuel and a couple other places as well. There's a lot of work going on up here right now to qualify the size and extent of it. Your traditional oil fields are large. Your residual oil zone opportunities are just as large. You have a massive CO2 market in your backyard. And this goes on in other parts around the world as well. When you have $100 crude oil, you can afford to do a lot of these studies, and a lot of people have done them. I won't go into it. In December, they released the study. The DOE then announced we're going to do another 8-county study. First hints, the other 8 counties might double the $100 billion that the first 4-county study identified. The only kick is we don't have enough CO2. We're net short CO2 in the Permian, have been for about 3 years, 4 years. Over here in North Dakota, the EERC, about 3 years ago, Harold Hamm told these guys, listen, I'm getting 5% of my resource out of these oil shale plays. I know it's there, but I don't know how to get the rest of it out. See what you can find. So John Harju and his guys at the facility began work, and one of the things they tried was CO2 in a unique setting. And what they found is it's highly likely they could get another 5 to 7% of original oil in place out of oil shale. It's been produced down to 5%, get the tail end of that decline curve, and CO2 might give them another 5 to 7%. That would double North Dakota's oil resource recoverables. The key is going to be CO2 and price. Always price, always price. But what it does, we now in the United States, now more so than ever before, know what kind of resource capacity that we have that we never knew we had 10 years ago. The CO2 EOR has turned out to be fairly massive. So if we're really going to capture a lot of CO2 in the United States, we got a place to put it and monetize it securely, not be penalized by having it. We have a shale resource that 10 years ago we had no clue the size and extent of it. And even today we really still don't know. Those millions of barrels a day of production that we've got are based on 5% of the recoverable original oil in place in the rock we've identified. So new technology is going to be at play out here. And if you can do CO2 to enhance more of it, you got more demand. So lots of fun stuff over the horizon. If shale play works for CO2, you have a global market that U.S. technology could have an ultimate play, or U.S. gasification technology to drive CO2 to in the future. Over the horizon, things to look forward to. CO2 shipping, some places are going to have too much CO2. There's been a lot of work done to identify the opportunity to move CO2 from places with too much CO2 to places that could use it. It's well understood. And there's a whole slew of things going on because these propane and ethane exports out of the U.S., those ships could carry CO2 on a backhaul back to the U.S. There's a number of groups working on that now. Coal markets, I'm not going to tell you what you guys know about your own stuff, but we're down at this end of the world in Central Europe. China, India, Far East is the wild card. How do you get it there? How do you make it fit? How do you make them want it? How do you make them pay for it? And then do we know how to move coal around the world? Those are markets for U.S. coal. So whether it comes from Wyoming and gets in any one of those countries, that was 2012. Now some of those aren't real big customers, but they're customers. That means somebody shipped it, somebody's paid for it, funded it, been to the bank with it, been through ports with it, loaded it, terminaled it, and got it to those markets. So there is hope. There are markets, a lot of it out there. So have a little competition. And in LNG, awesome stuff. As long as the United States was a low-cost provider of cheap gas, we were the ultimate wedge in the game. Because global LNG gas, there's a quasi-unofficial cartel that pegged LNG against an index on crude prices. Crude at $100 made U.S. natural gas / LNG look really cheap. Well, guess what? Crude's not cheap. Crude is really cheap now. The index has collapsed. So U.S. LNG may not compete against Australia's desire to manage the Far East markets, or Qatar's desire to get market share that they don't have any control over because of the price of crude having come down. So we are now going to compete in the global LNG market just like everybody else. We have no unfair advantage anymore unless crude goes back up. The price was in the index. The value for us was in the index. Now we're on equal footing. Now the question will remain, which LNG export projects go forward these are big, monster, expensive projects with a 7-year lead time. $10 billion here and there in a tough time. My guess is we'll lose a couple here and we'll lose a couple overseas as well. It'll change very fast. And the cheap natural gas in the United States with those decline curves and all the industrial load that wants to suck it up. Also, gas is moving out of the United States. It's just not leaving as LNG. Mexico's absorbing quite a bit of it. And it's going up in other places. Anywhere we have an access point by pipe, it's moving by gas and not as LNG. And power generation is big on the table in Mexico, and gas is good for power generation in Mexico like it is in the U.S. And then one last piece, a couple of LNG export facilities that are going to be running did something that anybody in the manufacturing chain needs to do is you secure your raw resource. You secure the firm transport to get that resource to your facility, and you secure long-term customers for your output. So Freeport is one, but also Cheniere. So what they do, they went up the pipeline capacity to move Marcellus, cheap Marcellus gas to the Gulf Coast. About 6 BCF of capacity, firm capacity, was all taken by Cheniere. So even if you had additional gas in Marcellus to get to the Gulf Coast, the next thing you do is you've got to build new pipelines to get to the Gulf Coast. The reverse lines, the firm capacity, firm transport capacity, have been taken. So lots of things to think about in the logistics if you're an industrial consumer and all that kind of stuff. Shipping impactors. China. China loves this game. They'll go back in the canal through Nicaragua. Pretty wild game, except, you know, about 100 years ago, the United States did the same thing for strategic reasons. Now the Chinese are doing it for strategic reasons. So we may have 2 canals, which might mean that shipping rates could be cheaper. Will the Chinese build it? $50 billion? More than likely, because it's a strategic asset for them. Panama Canal expansion, I won't go into the details. It's on track. It'll get done. It'll open up a lot of pathways for things that we hadn't thought about before. So here's a fun one. Arctic sea routes. Climate change is real. Arctic ice is going to melt. Climate change isn't real. Arctic ice won't melt. Well, take your pick. Anyway, we have shipped stuff over the North Pole. In fact, one of the first cargoes, first series of cargoes left Canada was coal going over to Finland. So we're already moving coal over the North Pole as export commodity. I'm not so sure some of that coal wasn't from the U.S. that worked its way into Canada and got out of Vancouver. I can give you the ship name and all that. So it's already happening. People are laying their routes. The Russians are big, the Chinese are big, securing, building facilities for ship stores and refueling up in the Arctic in areas where they can do it. Navajo Free Trade Zone. So in the face of adversity, you got to get creative. This was 2013. I don't know how much further this has gone from this point where the discussions began. But they said, you know, we're stranded in the middle of the United States with 40 billion tons of coal. We're not going to be able to consume it ourselves, but it's the future wealth of our people. It is our future wealth of our people. We're going to sell it, and we're going to get it out of this country. So one of the ways that they approached doing it was to create a free trade zone in discussion with BNSF at a place called Thoreau, New Mexico. And I don't know where it's at this stage of the game. There's a lot of political things that have gone on that have nothing to do with this that changed the makeup of the Navajos' playground, but they're being creative. A port off the coast of Veracruz with a rail line out of New Mexico down through Mexico for export and bypass all this blue stuff on the west coast of the United States. Those things are going on. And they're not the only ones that are talking. The Crow Nation works very close with the Navajo as well. They got 90 billion tons of coal they've been trying to take west, and they've hit the blue stuff also. So anyway, Gulf of Mexico, highly likely, not as much blue, but there's a little there. West Coast, possibly. Maybe Native Americans own the export facilities, and then they work at that angle. I don't know. Food for thought. So I could talk all night. I won't. I enjoy this stuff, and it's great to be up in Wyoming because you guys got a heck of a lot of resources up here.
You're a good man. So we have questions from anyone. So let's give Mike a big hand. His presentation will be posted online in the next coming days. So, Michael, appreciate you.
You bet. Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you all.